My name is Gregory Shushan, and I'm a historian of religions. I've been working on the cross-cultural study of near-death experiences throughout history and around the world for about 25 years, and I've written a few books on the subject. And today I'm going to share with you my research in this area, give you a broad overview of the kinds of traditions I've looked at, the kinds of experiences I've looked at, and then also how I've interpreted them basically. So first of all, a lot of you probably already know what a near-death experience is, but if not, just to make sure we're on the same page, the way I define it is a spontaneous, evidently universal occurrence in which the soul seems to leave the body during a period of either clinical death or near death, and it has spiritual episodes during that time of unconsciousness, comes back to the body, and then reports what those experiences are. So there's some confusion about the term. A lot of people seem to think it just means you almost got hit by a bus, or you, or you fell off a boat, or some kind of accident. But if it doesn't have that spiritual component, that traveling to another world, leaving the body element, then I don't consider it a near-death experience, and that's what the term generally refers to. So when people have these experiences, there's a number of elements to it that they often describe. And some of the most typical ones are the out-of-body experience, so the feeling that you've left your body, and then seeing your own body from a vantage point outside it. That's often the thing that leads people to realize that they have basically transcended their own death, that they've survived the death of their physical body and they're still conscious and able to see that body lying there. They report entering darkness, emerging into some kind of other realm that's filled with light. They encounter deceased relatives. They meet a being of light, and that being of light is often manifested in the form that's relevant to the person having the NDE. So a Buddhist will see the Buddha, a Christian will see Jesus, a Muslim will see Muhammad, and so on. There's also some kind of judgment or evaluation of their earthly life. In some cases, that's in the form of a panoramic life review, where people experience all of their memories happening at once. And that's sometimes accompanied by the emotions associated with those memories. So if you hurt other people, then you're going to be feeling that pain that you caused them. If you were a kind person, you'll be feeling that kindness, and so on. But reported in a way that's all at once, essentially. Then they reach obstacles or barriers. It's a point that they can't cross during the near-death experience, and that's at the point where they're sent back either by the being of light or by a relative, or sometimes they just wake up back in the body. The experience overall is associated with feelings of transcendence or unification with the divine, kind of cosmic unity. And then often when they return to the body, some kind of positive after effects are reported. Now, going back to this is actually the 50th anniversary of the study of near-death experiences formally in the West, which was inaugurated by Raymond Moody with the book Life After Life, published in 1975. So when Moody published his book, he identified these and other features of near-death experiences, but he was careful to explain that no two experiences are alike. There's no single example that he found that had all of the elements that he had isolated. So even then, he recognized that there were differences cross-culturally. Nevertheless, the way that near-death studies progressed over time, it was very much in the field of the sciences, medical sciences, psychology, psychiatry, and not really in the humanities. And so because of that, there wasn't really a lot of cross-cultural research. There wasn't really a lot of consideration of near-death experiences in other cultures. And so the way that the narrative of NDEs were kind of constructed in the West was very much a Western stereotypical model. But now, all these years later, I know of examples from all of these different regions that are seen there on the slide. And these were basically, for the most part, unknown in the early days of near-death studies. So it's taken quite a while to seek them out, to try to engage with them, and to try to make them relevant into the field of near-death studies, which still, for the most part, they're not taken into account. But regardless of the similarities and the differences across cultures, they all share this context of what happens when you die. So some of the differences, just in speaking generally, uh, one is the idea of speeding through a dark tunnel. I mentioned earlier going through darkness and coming into light. The stereotype is that we speed through a dark tunnel and then emerge into the realm of light. But in some cultures, there is no tunnel at all. Sometimes it's a vague darkness, but not a tunnel. And in some, it's completely different. In Polynesian societies, for example, there are a few accounts where they describe walking along a path or a road, and they look down and they're able to see the footprints of people who had traveled to the spirit village before them. There's one example where a woman is walking along this path to the other world, and on the way passing by her, she sees the spirit of another person who's just coming back from his near-death experience, walking back to his body as she walking towards the other world. Another example is in the West, people are often sent back to the body for some kind of personal reason, such as I need to take care of my loved one, I need to care for my son. Sometimes it's even things like I need to finish some project I was working on, I need to finish my PhD or my novel, or some kind of personal thing. Sometimes it's people are told that they need to spread the word that there is no death, that we don't die, that there is an afterlife. But in some Eastern societies, for example, in India and Japan, China, there are examples where it's a case of mistaken identity, essentially. There was a bureaucratic clerical error in the other world. So, for example, if I were to die having an NDE, I would go to the other world and I would be told by the spirits there, oh, hang on, our records show we got the wrong Gregory Shushan, you need to go back to your body. And then at that point, they would locate the Gregory Shushan that they were really looking for, who lives in, upstate New York or whatever. And then that person would die and I would wake up in my body having had an NDE. So all this is important. All this diversity and similarity is important for a few reasons. First of all, within the field of near-death studies itself, if you're theorizing about the nature of a near-death experience, about what it actually means, whether it's evidence for an afterlife or whether it's just the dying brain or whatever, you can't make theories based only on the single Western stereotypes when you've got differences going on in different cultures around the world. So to give an example of that, in the recent media in the last couple of years, there have been reports in popular science journals and websites that scientists have discovered that there is a massive burst of electromagnetical brain activity, a burst of this activity in the brain at the moment of death. So scientists said this is what's responsible for the life review. This is an element of the near-death experience that we're able to isolate, and that the dying brain is essentially creating the life review through this burst of electromagnetic energy. The problem there is cross-culturally, that ideal of the panoramic life review that I described earlier with everything happening at once, all your memories flooding your consciousness, that's not reported cross-culturally for the most part. There are no examples in small-scale societies and really hardly any examples in the historical literature at all. Instead, there's some kind of evaluation of a person's life, symbolized in different ways, again, depending on the culture. There's a Native American example that comes to mind where this Native American man is having an NDE and he goes to this, he's in a sort of office type room and there's a man sitting behind the desk who's going to help him, decide what's going to happen to his soul at the next stage. And on a photograph on the wall behind this man, there's a picture of the guy having the NDE, and somehow that picture embodies all of his earthly deeds. So the concept is there, but there is no panoramic life review. And if the near-death experience was just the dying brain shutting off, creating special effects, then they should be having these kinds of experiences cross-culturally. So it's kind of a challenge to some of the theorizing going on in near-death studies, specifically when it's saying that they're all the same because of a dying brain, because they're not all the same. So the second thing that's important about exploring both the similarities and the differences across cultures is that they allow us to understand the religious and philosophical dimensions of near-death experiences, which has been really neglected throughout the history of religions, which is my own field, as I mentioned. And that's really the question that's at the heart of my work, and the one that's been neglected in the world of historical religious studies and anthropology. And one of the most interesting aspects of that whole dimension of NDEs to me is the idea that they might have influenced afterlife beliefs around the world and throughout history. Now, that's a notion known as the experiential source hypothesis. That's a phrase that was come up with by David Hufford in relation to sleep paralysis, but it essentially means that there is some kind of objective, extraordinary experience that happens to people, and they then base their beliefs on it, rather than people have these beliefs and then they kind of model experiences or their imagination creates experiences to conform to those beliefs. So, in other words, the experiences happen first. They're the primary event in the generation of different beliefs. And this is, I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. Going back to 1871, even E.B. Tyler, a famous anthropologist, he wrote a book called Primitive Religion, which is not a term we would use nowadays. But even in relation to near-death experiences specifically, he wrote, men whose spirits, traveling in hallucinations of extreme illness to the land of the dead, have returned to reanimate their bodies and tell what they have seen. And he argued that those kinds of experiences might have formed the foundations of religious beliefs. So that is essentially not only a description of a near-death experience over 100 years before Raymond Moody, it's also an articulation of that experiential source hypothesis. Now, all of these other scholars and anthropologists on this slide reach similar conclusions, specifically in relation to near-death experiences and the cultures that they were studying. And that's all really important for two reasons. The first is that all of them were well before the term near-death experience even existed, before it was a formal field of study in the West. So that shows that that NDEs are not like some new age idea, this idea that was just kind of created in the modern West. And secondly, it shows how, despite that consistency of the conclusions of all of these scholars, that there is a relationship between NDEs and afterlife beliefs cross-culturally, and that they all independently, for the most part, came to the same conclusion. I say independently because, so for example, the Tyler quote that I mentioned earlier, that's all he says about near-death experiences. And then a few years later, Andrew Lang talks about them again in a very short paragraph. Howitt and Tregear, respectively, Native Americans in Australia, James Mooney, all these guys basically would come up with this idea. They'd rediscover it without reference to the earlier scholars, as if it was a kind of new discovery, and then it would be forgotten for another 50 years or 100 years or whatever. Ake Hultkrantz, who is there in the far right, wrote a book called The Native American Orpheus Tradition, and that's probably the best articulation of it, but again, it was before near-death experiences. He discovered, though, with Native Americans that they made a distinction between dreams, visions, and near-death experiences, and that they gave near-death experiences the most value as far as the knowledge and wisdom that they contained. So in other words, there has been this undercurrent running through the history of religions for over 150 years, but near-death experiences are still being systematically ignored by everyone but a very, very, very few scholars. I won't say I'm a field of one, but it's pretty close. But the important thing to stress also is that it's not just a matter of there's some pure cultureless experience that's leading people to invent these beliefs. It's really a symbiotic process, as James McLennan put it, where culture shapes the accounts of near-death experiences, and the accounts themselves affect the experiences. And I'll get back to that at the end after I've given you some examples and we've delved a little bit more deeply into this. But I should also add that the experiential source hypothesis doesn't claim that near-death experiences are either metaphysical or that they're the result of a compromised or dying brain. For example, the scientific philosopher Thomas Metzinger, he sees out-of-body experiences as basically a purely neuroscientific phenomenon. They can be explained entirely in physical brain terms. But he also believes that the experiences happen and that they lead to beliefs in dualism across cultures. Dualism just being the belief that the body that the spirit can exist separately from the body. And so he wrote, for anyone who's actually had an OBE, an out-of-body experience, it's almost impossible not to become an ontological dualist afterwards. In other words, to firmly believe through experience that your soul really does can live independently from the body. In all of their realism, their cognitive clarity, and their general coherence, the experiences almost inevitably lead the experiencer to conclude that consciousness can, as a matter of fact, operate independently of the brain and body. And this is something we see over and over in near-death experiences. Almost nobody who has an NDE comes back from it and says, that was a really weird hallucination, or I had the strangest dream. They almost always believe that it was genuinely an experience of traveling to the other world. The realism is extraordinarily profound to them, and it also lasts throughout their lives. So decades later, they will say that it's still just as vivid as the day it happened, and that it still has the same transformational effects on them. So as far as Metzinger is concerned, though, an apparently metaphysical experience, which he believes is a neuropsychological experience, nevertheless leads to a metaphysical belief. So the importance of that is that you don't have to believe that near-death experiences are genuinely evidence for an afterlife in order to accept that they're influencing beliefs around the world. And that obviously has a parallel just in individuals, because people who have NDEs, whether they're atheists or what, they will come back from the experience and often change their beliefs. They're no longer afraid of death. They now believe in an afterlife, and so on. So I came to this study from a completely different background and different angle than most near-death experience researchers. As I mentioned, I'm a historian of religions. I started out in Egyptian archaeology, and the way I kind of came into this project was I noticed that with Egyptian afterlife beliefs, there was essentially, if you strip back some of the cultural overlay, as it were, when looking at their afterlife beliefs, and specifically the journey to the other world, they very much resembled a near-death experience. So I was looking at the earliest Egyptian texts, the pyramid texts and the coffin texts. These are the kind of foundations of the later Book of the Dead and later other Egyptian afterlife texts. And they're essentially guidebooks to the other world. They're ritual guidebooks that help the soul of the dead negotiate the afterlife journey and achieve a positive outcome in the other world. So they describe the soul leaving the body, in this case it's the mummy, travels through darkness, goes to this other world, which is a realm of light. The soul meets a being of light in the form of the sun god Re, encounters deceased ancestors, relatives. There's a evaluation of their earthly life that's kind of facilitated by deities in the other world. There's an association between the self and the divine. So there's that theme of divinization and transcendence that I mentioned earlier. And there's also an interesting parallel with the idea that the deceased, the soul of the dead, is associated specifically with Osiris, who is the god of the dead and the god of judgment. So there's repeated references to the soul being actually Osiris. So on the one hand, that's evidence, I think, of self-judgment, because if the soul of the dead is also the judge, then it's a judgment of the self. But also the soul of the dead encounters the corpse of Osiris in this deep, dark area of the underworld. And the text basically says, as you realize that this corpse of Osiris is also you, that's the thing that enables you to proceed to the next stage of the afterlife realm. So it's the realization that you've transcended your own death by encountering your own corpse, which is also the corpse of the Lord of the Dead, that enables you to proceed. And that's pretty much a parallel with near-death experiencers who say they realized that they were dead once they saw their body lying there, and that led them to understand that they'd survived the death of their body. So I hasten to add that there are no examples of actual near-death experiences from ancient Egypt. So I was looking at religious texts, ritual texts, in light of near-death experiences. The reason there were no accounts of NDEs from ancient Egypt is just because there was no context for them to be reported. as far as the uses to which writing were put in ancient Egypt. It was really for religious and ritual purposes, political, priestly, things associated with the pharaoh, royal decrees, and also bureaucracy, recording sales and divorce decrees and things like that. But there's basically no personal narratives or reporting of strange events or anything like that from a kind of factual perspective. So what I wanted to do was compare the afterlife beliefs of ancient Egypt, which at that point I had thought, okay, this is very much like a near-death experience. And I wanted to see the degree to which the NDE phenomena, these elements of the NDE, could also be found in the civilizations of other cultures around the world. So I compared the Egyptian case with ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, India before the kind of what we know of as Hinduism. It's the Vedic period of the earliest texts from India, China before Buddhism, and then the Mesoamerican civilizations of the Aztec and Maya. And again, I compared the earliest afterlife beliefs, descriptions of afterlife journeys in all of these civilizations with Egypt, and I found essentially those same 9 elements, as if they were transposed from the near-death experience onto the beliefs of each of those civilizations. What I didn't expect to find were actual descriptions of near-death experiences or evidence for near-death experiences embedded in these ancient texts. So again, everywhere except Egypt had overt near-death experience accounts or descriptions of that showed that they knew about them. So just to give a few examples, I think the earliest near-death experience possibly ever recorded in the world was to the king Gilgamesh. A lot of people might have heard of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's his later name. His Sumerian name was Gilgamesh. This is going back to about 1800 BCE, possibly even as early as 2000. But he is known as a historical king. He is, there's evidence that he existed as a real person. So that right away is a point for it being a genuine near-death experience. The text describes how he is lying on his deathbed and he traveled to the other world. His soul travels to the other world while his body's on the deathbed. He's told not to enter this other world with an angry heart, that his heart has to be purified. Then he's met by a group of deities radiating light. One of these deities is the sun god Utu, obviously a being of light, and the counterpart to the Egyptian sun god Re. These gods review his good deeds in order to determine his fate. And in the Sumerian context, and because he was a king, it's things like, did you perform the correct rituals? Did you build the correct temples? Did you provide for the populace? Were you a good ruler, essentially? Then there's a funerary banquet that's thrown in his honor, and he's greeted by his deceased relatives, along with various other people that he had known in life. And the experience is described as essentially transformative, because it says his heart was undone by Utu, the being of light. So these gods decide that he's going to become a demigod in the next life, when he actually dies, and they're going to make him a judge and one of the rulers of the netherworld. Finally, he returns to his body and he wakes up and he's able to then prepare his funeral and get his effects in order, essentially, for his coming death. The narrative stresses that the experience was exceptional, and I think that probably reflects the idea that given the medical resuscitation technology of 2000 BCE, there were not that many people having near-death experiences. So then from 5th century India, 5th century BCE, there's an account of a little boy named Nachiketas from the Upanishads. This is a kind of culmination of a series of accounts of legends or myths of a little boy who travels to the afterlife realm and returns to the body. As time goes on, the account is more and more fleshed out, and this is kind of one of the most fleshed out versions. It tells of how one day he's watching his father giving away all of his possessions. And he's puzzled and he says, Father, to whom will you give me? And the father basically says, leave me alone, I'm busy. And Nachiketas keeps kind of pestering his dad, asking him this question over and over. And finally he says, I'll give you to death, just in frustration, which is, kind of colloquial way of saying, you go to hell. So Effectively, that means he kills the boy, and the boy goes to the other world, the realm of Yama, who is the Lord of the Dead, called Yamaloka. Except Yama's not there. Yama's nowhere to be seen, and so the boy's left unattended in this underground realm for 3 days without food. And then finally, when Yama arrives, he's so abashed by his lapse in hospitality that he decides to give Nachikitas 3 wishes. So this is very different from the account of Gilgamesh. We have these kind of narrative plot structure elements that are lacking in that other account. Um, so Nachiketa's first wishes for his father's kindness once he returns to his body, which is interesting because it suggests that he knows that he's having a near-death experience and he knows he's going to be returning. His second wish is for the secrets of the fire altar to be revealed to him because he knows that knowing that will help him will lead him to heaven when he eventually does die for good. So Yama agrees to grant these 2 wishes, but then the third wish, Nachiketa says he wants to understand the mysteries of the afterlife itself. And here Yama is reluctant and he tries to put the boy off and he says things like, it's hard to understand. It's a subtle doctrine. Ask something else. I don't really want to, reveal this to you. But the little boy persists. As we saw at the beginning, he's a very persistent little boy, and he argues who's better to give him information about the afterlife than the Lord of the Dead himself. So eventually Yama gives in and he reveals that the significant thing that he needs to know is the importance of the word Om, which you probably all know as the transcendent sound representing the divine in the cosmos. And knowing this syllable will enable the soul to realize its oneness with the divine in the afterlife, essentially. So Nachikitas chooses knowledge for 2 of his wishes, which I think reinforces the connection that the afterlife realm is a place of transformation and the attainment of wisdom. Now, I don't think this account is a straight up near-death experience. I think it shows knowledge of near-death experiences and that it's a mythologized account, or at least it was written with knowledge of accounts. From the Atharva Veda, another ancient Vedic text, it's a kind of magical medical text. We have descriptions of near-death experiences, and that in a medical context, basically instructing how shaman doctors can send their soul to the other world to retrieve the souls of people who are having NDEs, who are in danger of dying. From China, from around 750 BCE, we have a really interesting account about a provincial ruler named Qianxi. Now, it describes how he is ill, he's lying on his deathbed, and after 2.5 days in a coma, he wakes up. He claims that he had been to the realm of the Emperor of Heaven, and he was enjoying himself, wandering through the spirit world with different spirits and gods. People were dancing, and he heard music, and the whole thing he found very moving and joyful. But then, while he was still in the other world, he was attacked by a bear. This is something I've not run across in any other near-death experience. And the emperor tells him to shoot it, and he does. And then another bear comes, and he kills that one too. Now, the emperor is impressed, and he's also grateful that, his life was also saved. And so he gives some gifts to Jianzi, baskets containing a set of things, which we're not told what they are, some kind of secret things. And he also gives him, good favor when he goes back to his body, when he goes back to resume the rest of his life. He basically gives him, grants him a good life. And he also makes some political prophecies about things that will happen in his career. Now, before returning to Earth, though, Jianzi looks next to where the emperor is standing, there's a small boy. And he just kind of, remembers that. He's sent back to his body, and a number of years later, the text isn't very clear, but it's at least 10 or 20 years later, he's walking down the street, and there's a man blocking his way. This is a different village, a different province, a place he's never been. He doesn't know anybody. And this man just refuses to budge, and he's making eye contact with him, and Jianxi's thinking, well, do I know this guy from somewhere? He looks really familiar. And finally, the man says, on such and such a date, you had a near-death experience. You left your body. You went to visit the Emperor of Heaven. You saved him from being attacked by 2 bears. He granted you these good favor. He recounts basically the entire near-death experience. And Jianxi says, "This is amazing. How did you know that?" And the man says, "I was the little boy standing there at the side of the emperor." So essentially, this little boy just happened to be having a near-death experience at the same time as Jianxi, and then he remembered it and happened to recognize Jianxi all these years later. This is actually a kind of evidential component of near-death experiences that is known in contemporary Western accounts. There are accounts where people will go to the other world and meet somebody who they didn't know had died, and then they come back and that the death of that person is actually confirmed. So if I were to have a near-death experience and I would see my Uncle Bill, I don't have an Uncle Bill, but if I did and saw his spirit there, and then I would come back and my mom would say, "Oh, I'm so glad to have you back, but by the way, Uncle Bill died," that would be pretty strong evidence of a near-death experience. And we do have those kinds of accounts. We also have children who recognize relatives who they had never met, and then they're shown photographs of them later, and they say, "That's the grandma I saw in the other world," or whatever. So in this case, that account acted as proof for the Chinese authorities that near-death experiences are real. And they recorded this account as a factual occurrence. They basically took names and dates. They got witness testimonies, and they filed this report in the official Government Bureau of Documents. So it was taken very seriously and, again, validated near-death experiences for Chinese authorities, historians, and religious leaders. And then finally, looking at Mesoamerica, there's a remarkable near-death experience of a 15th century Aztec princess named Quetzalcoatl. This was recorded by a Spanish missionary and ethnographer named Bernardino de Sahagún. A lot of these Spanish missionaries, obviously their intent was to convert the populace in order to conquer them. And so it was a question of cultural and social takeover and annihilation to an extent. And a lot of them went about this in pretty heavy-handed ways, and they didn't have any kind of empathy for the indigenous beliefs or traditions. Sahagún was a little bit different. He actually learned the languages of the people he was there to convert. He was careful to talk to the priests and the elders to get the kind of most authentic, representative beliefs of the people that he could. And essentially was a decent ethnographer for his day, centuries before the term ethnography or even the concept of ethnography or anthropology were even in existence. So all that is by way of saying this is a pretty reliable report as far as we can tell. It also happened to a person who we know of as a historical individual, Quetzalcoatl. She was the daughter-in-law of a ruler of the Tlatelolco city-state, a man named Moki Huish, again, who we know as a historical figure. So he actually killed her. She died after being assaulted by him, for reasons that were not specified in the text. And her family said, "Don't cremate her," which was the tradition at the time. "We have to bury her instead." They had some feeling that they didn't want her to be cremated. But the account does emphasize she had indeed died and describes how her corpse was prepared for the burial. Her grave was dug deeply, the earth was packed down firmly, and it was covered with stones. So after Quetzalcoatl came to life, she described how a sickly, deformed youth appeared and told her to sing despite her sufferings, and then he guided her on a trip to the other world in her disembodied form. He took her to Tlalocan, which is the paradise of the dead, sacred to the god Tlaloc. And there she met this god Tlaloc. He showed her a vision on earth of how the priests were dancing for her, either at her funeral or in order to bring her soul back. I'm not really sure because the text doesn't say. But she also meets deceased relatives. She sees her stepson who had died as a small child. And she also has a vision of the Spaniards coming to conquer Mexico, essentially. She meets the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma, who had died a few years earlier, and he prophesies this to her. Unfortunately, the next page of this manuscript is missing, so we don't actually have details of Quetzalcoatl's return to her body. But there's a related account about 30 years later from Tenochtitlan, which is a neighboring state, modern Mexico City. It might be the same account, slightly tweaked, or it might be a completely different one. There's really no way of knowing. But it also happened to a woman of quality, as the text says, and she came to life after 4 days. And it says how her grave burst open, and that the stones and piling on top and the earth went flying everywhere. So it was very dramatic um, kind of return. And there's also this idea of the Spanish conquest that she had predicted. But what makes these accounts especially interesting is how they were later combined and reworked by Spanish missionaries as basically Catholic colonialist propaganda. So there's a version by Juan de Torquemada, a famous missionary, where he recasts the woman as a sister of Montezuma II. And he says, instead of a sickly, deformed youth who met her and led her on her journey to Tlaloc, she's now met by a shining winged angel with a white robe and a cross on his head. This very Christianized angel takes her on an otherworld journey that's much more consistent with medieval European afterlife journeys than it is with anything that's culturally Mexican. And then the prophecy that she learned during her very Christian experience wasn't about the fall of Mexico. It wasn't a warning that the Spanish are coming and we better prepare. It was that she would become a leader in baptizing her people into this new faith. And then still later, Francisco Javier Claviero, he wrote that she was the perfect model of Christian values, and that she brought back from her NDE the good news about the true God, the creator of heaven and earth. And she was now seen as the first person, the first indigenous person to bring baptism to her people. And it was that version that became sanctioned as actual historical truth by the Vatican. She wasn't turned into a saint actually, but close enough. And so it's accepted as a genuine miracle. And the story is told and retold in songs and poetry and stories in Mexico even to this day. So that attests to the potential political force of near-death experiences, which is more along the lines of what I looked at in across my second cross-cultural comparison, which was on near-death experiences in indigenous religions. Now, this study is very different because, unlike the ancient civilizations, we have quite a number of verbatim accounts of near-death experiences from these different societies. These were gathered either by missionaries or early explorers or early ethnographers. And what I did is I tried to limit the accounts that I was looking at to the times before Christianity or Islam were profound influences in any of these religious beliefs. So essentially, we have a number of actual unambiguous near-death experience accounts, rather than trying to kind of piece together whether they are embedded in the afterlife beliefs. So it's less speculative, and it was more a case of looking at the ways in which these different cultures responded to near-death experiences, and the ways in which they incorporated them into their beliefs or otherwise. So just to give I'll give one example from each region from this study. First, I looked at Oceania, which was Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Australia, basically that whole region. And I found a number of similarities and differences, but a really almost iconic near-death experience was from Hawaii and from this 19th century woman named Kalima. She died of an illness, and her body was prepared for burial. Her grave was dug. All of the mourners had gathered around, and then suddenly she revived, opened her eyes, and her family were initially afraid because they didn't realize that it was really her. They just saw like this body's coming back to life. But then once they realized it was really her, they were happy to have her back. And she says, "I have something very strange to tell you. I died, as you know. I seemed to leave my body, and I stood beside it, looking down on what was me. The me that was standing there looked like the form I was looking at, only I was alive and the other was dead." I find that a really interesting and kind of profound effort to describe an out-of-body experience, which must be a pretty indescribable thing, really. I gazed at my body for a few minutes and then I turned and walked away. So remember I said earlier these accounts where people walk to the spirit village rather than rushing through a tunnel. This is another example. So she walked away from her village, kept walking until she reached the village of the spirits, and there she recognized many souls of people who she had known in life. That confused her because she still didn't even realize that she was dead at that point. She knew all these people were dead, but she's thinking, but I'm alive, so how am I seeing all these dead people? She was very struck by how happy everybody was. She said there was laughter and bright, loving words on every tongue. She said, I felt so full of joy that my heart sang within me, and I was glad to be dead. She continues her journey of the other world through other spirit villages, and then she ultimately reaches a volcano known as Pele's Pit. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning these borders or barriers that near-death experiencers often reach. Pele's Pit was Kalima's. The spirits there told her, it's not your time to die yet. You must go back to your body. But she protested and she says, I do not want to go back. I begged and I prayed to be allowed to stay with them, and they said, no, you must go back. And if you do not go willingly, we will make you go. So at this point, all of those happy spirits who are joyful and happy to see her, they literally turn on her and they chase her with clubs, and they're basically driving her out of the spirit world. She even specifies that she had to run for 60 miles. Finally, she reaches her body back on Earth and she says, I looked at it and I hated it. Was that my body? What a horrible, loathsome thing it was to me now, since I had seen so many beautiful and happy creatures. Must I go and live in that thing again? No, I would not. I rebelled and I cried for mercy. But, it was not her time to die, and the spirits weren't going to take no for an answer. So they pushed her soul headfirst through the big toe of her body. That's not a mode of re-entering the body that I've come across anywhere other than Polynesia, but there are quite a few Polynesian accounts of the soul re-entering the body through the big toe, including in accounts of shamans who have otherworld journeys. And Kalima concludes, then my body came to life again. I opened my eyes, but I wish I'd stayed with those happy people. It was cruel to make me come back. My other body was so beautiful and I was so happy. And the woman who recorded this account for Kalima said she never ceased to regret coming back to her body. So this is very much like contemporary NDEs in a lot of ways, but again, with very obvious Hawaiian Polynesian kind of cultural accounts with a volcano, Pele, the spirit villages, and walking along the path, and so on. There's this fascinating Native American account from a Kiowa prophet named Bianchi. This is also from the 19th century. Bianchi was actually inspired by the ghost dance religious revitalization movement, which itself came about from as a result of the NDEs of their founders, specifically Wovoka, who was a northern Paiute Native American. He had an NDE, came back to life, and basically wanted to share the experience with the people. And he did that through this new religious movement called the ghost dance, where people would dance and chant and drum and possibly take drugs to the point of collapse and exhaustion, with the intent that once they collapse in this trance state, their bodies would travel to the other world in a safe way rather than having to temporarily die in order to get there. So essentially, he wanted to democratize access to the afterlife for everybody, especially not just for the trippiness of the experience, but to allow people to access the positive transformational effects that near-death experiencers report and that he himself benefited from. So Bianchi was one of these ghost dance religious movement followers, and he instituted his own kind of version of this revitalization movement. He had near-death experiences, and he had shamanic type near-death experiences, and the context of them is not always clear. So I kind of look at them as shamanic NDEs rather than necessarily spontaneous ones. So he would go into trance through extremes of fasting and prayer and sending his soul to the other world. And he did this frequently. And what makes his experiences so interesting is that he actually illustrated them. And the slide up there is an illustration of one of his NDEs. He describes this picture as representing that his soul traveled across a plain of buffalo and ponies until it reached the spirit village. And there he met four women he had known in life. They arrived on horseback with sacks of wild plums, and they're represented there on the right. They told him where to find his deceased brothers, and so he went to greet them, and they are represented there on the left. But on the way, he met these two curious beings, which he depicted as those small green triangular figures with crosses on their tops in the middle. There's definitely some Christian syncretistic influence going on in this, as evidenced by those crosses, and the next slide, which I'll show you in a minute. So his brothers told him to continue how to get to the spirit village. And when he got there, he came upon a large ghost dance circle, which you can see there in the middle. What I find fascinating about that is that the ghost dance is intended to send your soul to the spirit realm, but Bianchi is already in the spirit realm. So where a ghost dance circle, where the ghost dance in a spirit realm would send you, unfortunately isn't specified, but it implies that there would be some higher spirit realm or some higher dimension that spirits in the spirit realm would be able to access through the ghost dance. So he goes to the spirit village, he meets his relatives, and they offer him food, but he refuses it, which is a cross-cultural element that if you eat food in the afterlife, you risk having to stay there. And then he finally wakes up on the side of the mountain at the place where he had gone into his trance. Now, here on the left is another illustration of Bianchi's near-death experience. Unfortunately, he doesn't, there's no record of what that actually means. But at the top, with some kind of speculative imagination, I feel like that top picture is like maybe the stripes of a tunnel, like kind of representing a tunnel, and those stars and sparks at the end are the light at the end of the tunnel. The middle, it looks like some kind of pathways and obviously some kind of metaphysical stuff is going on there that he's trying to depict an ineffable cosmic transcendental experience through this very earthly form of colored pencils. And then at the bottom we have this being who seems to be radiating light. He has a cross on his head, so I don't know if that's Jesus or not. And then that rainbow-like structure beneath him, maybe that is also a kind of tunnel type thing. But the important thing about it is on the picture on the right, that's actually Bianchi himself. And he is holding the picture on the left that he had drawn. And he's teaching his people and the anthropologists who are talking to him about the afterlife by reference to his actual own experience and the drawings that he made of experience. So this is an unambiguous, very obvious example of that experiential source hypothesis that I had talked about earlier. This is unambiguous proof of that hypothesis in a Native American account. That drawing, by the way, had never been published before until it was used on the cover of my book there. I dug it up in the Smithsonian archives, and there are hardly any illustrations of actual near-death experiences in any culture at any time. So I was really happy to bring that to light. So in this study, I found about 70 accounts of Native American near-death experiences, either full-blown accounts or at least references to them, where people said somebody went there and came back, and that's how we know about the afterlife. Of those 70, I found at least 20 indigenous statements that their afterlife beliefs originated in near-death experiences. So again, that experiential source hypothesis being validated over and over and over. In the Pacific, I found 36 accounts of near-death experiences, and over half of them with statements that those experiences actually were the source of their afterlife beliefs. But it's not quite as simple as that. This isn't a universal phenomenon going on. The NDE is universal, but human response to it, just like everything else, has a lot of diversity. So of all those Pacific examples I mentioned, all of them were from Polynesia or Melanesia. I found none from Micronesia or Australia. And I think that's because in Australia, for example, the context of the near-death experience, the death and return element wasn't as important as the experience itself, and it was seen as more like a shamanic type phenomena. And so I think that there were lots of descriptions of shamanic journeys to other worlds without the afterlife context, and I think that's because they just didn't bother to record it, because a person was a shaman by virtue of their travels to the other world. So that the way in which it might have happened through an NDE or through um, drugs or meditation or chanting or whatever was kind of irrelevant culturally. Um, Now, from sub-Saharan Africa, a completely different story. Um, I found maybe 8 or 10 near-death experiences. I say 8 or 10 because a couple of them are a little borderline as far as context goes. And of those, I found only two statements that afterlife beliefs originated in them. So there's a very key cultural difference going on there. And I thought I need to try to find a way of explaining why that would be the case, why these sub-Saharan African cultures um, are not responding to near-death experiences in the same ways that Native Americans or Polynesians or Melanesians are. And so I found that there are a lot of cultural factors that wrapped up in beliefs around death, dying, and the dead in general. So, for example, there was a hostility to the very idea of the dead returning to life. So, if somebody, so there are accounts of people who would return to life who probably had near-death experiences and would have talked about them, but they were prevented from doing so because within the culture, people thought that's not my loved one returning to life. That's somebody who's possessed by an evil spirit, or they're a victim of sorcery. They've been turned into a zombie. They didn't even see the walking corpse as their relative. They just saw it as inhabited by something evil. So there are cases where they would then stone that person to death, thinking that they were, protecting the community. And this was such a kind of ingrained belief that they would even do things to prevent near-death experiences from happening to begin with. So burial practices, for example, they would bind the hands and feet of the body to prevent them from moving or getting out of the grave if they did happen to come back to life. And they would pile stones on top of graves and various other kinds of techniques to prevent this from happening. This was the same in Micronesia, and I found no near-death experiences in Micronesia. So I think there is an obvious correlation there that they're being prevented from even happening. And then where we actually do have one example of a new religious movement from Africa being grounded in a near-death experience, it's not the actual near-death experience that's significant. And this is the case of an early 18th century Congolese prophet named Beatrice Kimpavida. She was a Catholic as well as a medium in the local Kimpasi cult in the Congo. It was a healing cult, and initiation into this cult involved a ritual death and resurrection. This was brought about by cutting off the circulation with tight bonds tied around your wrists and ankles and wherever, and that would lead to collapse with the intention of the body traveling to the other world. And then upon revival or rebirth, as they would see it, the initiates were believed to be possessed by a friendly guardian spirit who would stay with them for the rest of their lives. So the intention was not to go there and communicate with souls of the dead or to bring back some kind of transformational knowledge or whatever. It was to go there to open up your body and your existence to possession by a benevolent guardian spirit, essentially. So when Kimpavita died, she had a week-long illness. She actually had an NDE. She came back to life and she claimed that she met Saint Anthony, and he told her, "I have been sent from God to your head to preach to the people." He gave her various religious and political instructions, and then he entered into her body. She woke up and she remained possessed by Saint Anthony for the rest of her life. And then they would practice, these journeys to the other world on weekends to kind of reinvigorate the spirit energy. But any kind of leaving the body, entering darkness, deceased relatives, being of light, all of that is completely missing and irrelevant from these accounts. And this religion, nevertheless, led to quite a prominent new religious movement called Antonianism, and it was really in response to European colonialism and the religious and ethnic persecution that African people in this sub-Saharan region were suffering at the time. very much like the ghost dance, as I mentioned earlier, and also to some extent the Aztec example from Quetzalcoatl. So it just kind of stresses that near-death experiences have this political dimension, and they can be used as a force of resistance. Just to give one more example, there's some Native American accounts where the French missionaries are saying, when you die, you're going to go to hell because your religion is satanic, and you don't believe in the one true God, and you need to find Jesus, and only we will go to heaven because only we are the Christians, et cetera, et cetera. And the response from the Native Americans was, actually, we know somebody who just traveled to the underworld, or to the spirit world a few weeks ago. He died and came back to life, and he told us that, it's basically happy hunting grounds, and everyone's having this great experience over there, and it's this wonderful spirit village. So why should we believe you and your beliefs that are thousands of years old when one of us was just there recently? So it was used as this kind of tool of resistance. And then in some cases with Native American accounts, they were actually told by spirits in the other world, you need to go back and stop using colonial weapons and food, and stop trading with them, and cooperating or collaborating with them. Whereas others would say, you need to form closer ties with the invading Europeans because the only way for culture to survive is through cooperation. So they were being given conflicting advice, but it was still this way of preserving and revitalizing the culture in whatever way they could. So the kind of question that is on everybody's mind with this research, despite all the inherent interest in the history of religions elements, is there really an afterlife? And if my research suggests that there's an afterlife, or if it challenges the idea, I think it can be used to do either. I think it can support that there really is an afterlife, that NDEs are evidence for an afterlife, and it can also support the materialist examples, because if you say people around the world are having NDEs, you could say it's because the brain dies, and everybody has NDEs because everyone has dying brains. As I mentioned earlier, that has to be parsed a lot more in a lot clearer way. But there's also the argument that if near-death experiences are so different around the world, they can't be true evidence for an afterlife, because why would the afterlife be different for everybody? And I don't think that that's a challenge at all, actually. I don't see any problem with the possibility that there could be an actual afterlife, but that everybody experiences it in a different way. So essentially, what kind of afterlife could even be possible in light of all of the cross-cultural differences and the cross-cultural similarities that we've been talking about? And are differences problematic for either of the metaphysical or materialist theories? This has been approached not necessarily in relation to NDEs, but in relation to afterlife beliefs by a couple of scholars. H. Price there on the right was an Oxford philosopher. He had this idea of what he called an intersubjective afterlife, where he didn't use the term lucid dreaming, but essentially what he described was like a lucid dream, that we survive the death of our bodies, and we're in this lucid dreaming state where we're able to kind of creatively interact with the afterlife realm. We're not consciously creating everything about it, because this would be a shared lucid dream with group souls. So it would be kind of a collaborative effort in constructing the other world, partly through our subconscious use of symbolism, and partly through conscious action. And he thought that like-minded souls would be grouped together just naturally. We would just kind of gravitate towards soul groups that we had things in common with, and we had similar ways of thinking. The Buddhism scholar Carl Becker, who also wrote about near-death experiences in relation to China and Japan, he pointed out that this is very similar to concepts in Mahayana Buddhism, and it's very much a kind of lucid dream type afterlife. I think this is still probably a valid way to look at it, but at the same time, I also feel like it's not quite enough. And the reason for that is because of the near-death experience. As I mentioned, the near-death experience has this core of features, even though not all of them happen to everybody. They're fairly consistent as far as leaving the body, the being of light, and all the rest of it. So how is it that we have that core of similarities, but then we have all these differences? And so the way I look at that is that the near-death experience is essentially a thematically stable experience, or it's an objective experience that we experience in subjective ways. And what I mean by that is it's almost contentless. It's the being of light is a great example. There's this being of light, but we're not going to see it as anything other than a being of light unless we project our symbols onto it. As I mentioned earlier, a Buddhist will see it as the Buddha, Christian will see it as Jesus, a Hindu will see it as Shiva or Krishna or whoever. So I think we're in a way projecting our cultural symbolism onto the near-death experience as we're having it. I don't think there's a pure non-cultural near-death experience that's accessible to anybody, because I don't think that when we die, all of a sudden our consciousness becomes cultureless, and we don't have our memories and we don't have our symbols anymore. So I think it's those things that actually enable us to have those experiences in a way that makes sense to us, and then able to return and tell people about them. So I would also say that I don't feel like those differences are problematic to beliefs, because if you think about the way we all experience and perceive the present physical world, it's very, very different in different cultures around the world. And then there are cases of children who remember past lives, for example, reincarnation research from University of Virginia and people like Ian Stevenson. Um, so I think some people might have intersubjective afterlife, like H. Price, these group souls. Some people might be reborn in another world. Some people might be reborn in a new body in this world. I just don't see the difference as a problem cross-culturally. But I do think that listening to the testimonies of near-death experiencers, whether we believe in an afterlife or not, is important. I think it's important to not to pathologize the experience, not to see it as anomalous. And one thing I've discovered is that the more I talk about these accounts to people, almost every time when it's in person or an interactive talk, people say, "Oh, I had a near-death experience," or "My uncle had a near-death experience." My mom. They're really not as uncommon or unique as people think. And I think a lot can be gained by listening to people who actually have them.